Um, anyway, first of all, thank you to Ginny, to Shelley, to my sister Deborah, for all enabling me to come here and visit and speak to you. I happen to be visiting my sister and my mother for about 5 weeks, and this is about midway through my time over here. I'd like to start actually by paying a homage to my mother. Sometimes you think, I think it's important to pay homage to mothers. And last night I was in Phoenix with my mum, and this just came out of the blue. There was no prompting. She was reminiscing about her school in a village in the East Anglian Fens in Norfolk. And she said, I didn't go to a very good school. But what they didn't teach me, I tried to learn myself. And that has some resonance with a few of the things that I'm going to say today. So this is a kind of a intellectual journey, but it's also a personal journey. And as I was preparing for this talk, which for some reason I found more nerve-wracking than preparing for a talk at Harvard a few years ago, I was thinking that about 8 years of my life have been in formal education of one form or another. The first 5 years of my life were not in education because I was an infant. And then I had a period between studying for my MA in London and my PhD, which was in Berkeley, where I worked as a psychiatric nurse in the East End of London. And those were the sort of only years that I've had outside of education. I think I've been quite lucky to have enjoyed a career in universities, and I certainly feel that when I see younger colleagues joining academia now. The conditions for them are far more difficult than it was for me when I started. I started my studies at the University of Arizona, tertiary studies, University of Arizona. Then I went to the London School of Economics. Then I went on, as I said, to UC Berkeley. I've had various teaching assignments in the US. For 2 semesters, I taught at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. And from there, I had sort of side assignments at UPenn, Brown University. And before Britain voted, in my view, unfortunately, for Brexit, I was able to take advantage of European exchange programs. So I did some teaching in Roskilde in Denmark and Tromsø in Norway, and also in another program in Tokyo at a university called Saitama. Before that, I went to primary schools in the East Anglian Fens in England, and I went to high school in Avondale, Arizona, and graduated from Agua Fria High School there. So all of this experience has made me an observer of education, the educational process, and an advocate for education in general, including the kind of education that's provided at America's community colleges. And I think there's no equivalent, really, at least in Britain. I don't know if there are equivalents in other countries, but I really support the idea of enabling people who wouldn't normally be able to go straight into a 4-year college to have a couple of years of very good, from what I can see, education as a start. So I should also say, again, as a preliminary remark, I don't live in the United States. What I'm saying is not meant to be directive or prescriptive, and I leave this to educationalists, teachers, and the public at large in this country to decide what is the best course of action regarding education. So 2 aspects of my education, my experience, have influenced how I think about education. The first one is that I've worked with indigenous people as a researcher for most of my academic career. That's since the early 1990s. And working with them has shown me that education is undertaken differently in different societies, that knowledge is different in different societies, and how people think about the transmission of knowledge is different in different societies. The second aspect of my experience I think is pertinent, and both of these I'm going to expand on, is that I came from what we call in England a working class background. My mother's family were agricultural laborers. In fact, we came from almost a feudal setup. The first 5 or 6 years of my life and the first 2 or 3 years of Deborah's life was spent in a tied cottage without running water, without sanitation. So it was a feudal situation. So you're looking at people here from the feudal era. And in Britain, and to a large extent in this country too, people from these sorts of backgrounds have been excluded from higher education, higher formal education. So let me start with the first one, with the indigenous world. I've worked mostly with the Innu people of the Labrador-Quebec Peninsula in northern Canada, and I'll come back to them later. I've also worked at the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, and I visited indigenous people such as the Maasai in Tanzania, and the Hadza in Tanzania, the San Bushmen in Namibia, the Ainu in Hokkaido, Japan, the Sami in northern Norway. And when I interviewed and interacted with these people, they were all concerned with the survival and even revival of their unique views of the world, their unique languages, their arts, their sciences, and their beliefs. And most of them, in fact, all of them, are making efforts to maintain those. However, the relationship between indigenous people and nation-state governments have often been very problematic and fraught, as you know, living here. In the US and Canada, Native American children were subjected to compulsory classroom schooling. The most aggressive form of this was the residential and boarding schools, which was designed as a means of forced assimilation. If any of you have the chance to go to the Heard Museum in Phoenix, you'll see there's an excellent exhibition on the top floor about the boarding school experience and the Phoenix Indian School, which was in existence, I think, until the 80s or 90s. And I certainly remember when I went to Our Free High School that our sports teams played against the Phoenix Indian team. What these boarding schools did is it separated people from their ways of life, from their cultures, and often from their parents. And just a quick run through this. The first Indian school was set up in 1879 by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who had been the superintendent of the Fort Marion prison in Florida. So the actual design of the Carlisle School, which was the first one in the US, was drawn on the design of the prison at Fort Marion. His motto was, "Kill the Indian to save the man." And so the idea there was that the Native Americans may have certain knowledge and culture and language, but it's not important. That other forms of knowledge are important, and it's up to us. Oops. Okay. I've never visited there, but it's still there, and many Native Americans go there. Unfortunately, many died there too. One statistic about it from Preston McBride, a Comanche scholar who I met in Winnipeg a few years ago, was that more Native Americans died at school there than soldiers did in the Spanish-American War at the same time. Now, there were some positive effects of these schools, and for the students who attended them. They gained a knowledge of the English language, of literacy, of science, the arts, and some graduates became prominent spokespeople, authors, and doctors, such as Zitkala Sa, Charles Eastman, and my favorite, Luther Standing Bear, all whom were Lakota. And some learned, the skills that helped them succeed in American society. But it also caused transgenerational trauma. So a lot of Native American kids, when they returned to their parents, were not able to communicate with them because they had not been speaking their indigenous language for several years, and that was very painful. The same applied in Canada as well. These losses of culture were incurred by what I would call destructive inclusion into education. And I think there's been efforts, and I'm going to talk about this a bit more, to try to address this problem through cultural revitalization projects that Native Americans are doing all over the US, Canada, and other parts, and indigenous people are doing it in other parts of the world too. But also American institutions are have recognized the value of these cultures and these languages. So I had a year sabbatical, which I spent at the University of Arizona and in Tucson, and I noticed there that the Tohono O'odham language was widely taught, that non-indigenous students were going to that. And I'm sure at NAU, I imagine the Dene language is taught there. When I was at the University of Wyoming, there were Arapaho and Shoshone classes as well for native and non-native students. Okay, so that's a form of education that can be destructive. So I would call that destructive inclusion. But there's also, just before I get onto the positive, there's also destructive. Did I have a? Oh, sorry, these are a few more images of the Carlisle boarding school, and you can see these photographs. These are very famous ones. These by Nicholas Choate, who was commissioned by Pratt to do before and after photographs. So these are a group of Chiricahua Apache children that were brought as prisoners of war from Fort Marion Prison to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And this was the day they arrived. And then miraculously, a few weeks later, Choate took this photograph, and Pratt would send this to Washington, D.C. as evidence of the progress he had made with the students. I also wanted to say, before I go on to the destructive exclusion, that I've worked in this area of northern Canada. And I've worked with the Innu people who speak an Algonquin language. So it's related to Cree. They were permanent nomadic hunters until the 1960s, late 1960s in some cases. So people my age were born on the land. They were born in tents. And then in the 60s, the government of Canada forced them to live in government-built settlements, some in Labrador and some in Quebec. And one of the sort of rallying cries to do this was from the director of Northern Labradorian Affairs for the Canadian government, who basically was putting forth this doctrine that there's no alternative for people like the Innu. You know, civilizations on the northward march for the Eskimo or Inuit and the Innu, the Indian. There is no escape. You know, there's no turning back. They must become part of our society. So again, this idea, there's nothing to learn from them. We have nothing to learn from them. Even though this is one of the most demanding terrains on the planet. It's subarctic. Part of it is boreal forest. Part of it is tundra. Despite all of that, there's nothing to learn. They just have to be part of the dominant society. So I've worked with the Innu since the early 90s, and for a period of time, I used to go every year. And one of the things I was doing was documenting what you might call cultural continuity. So I was documenting what the Innu are doing to maintain their way of life and maintain their own education, which I would call experiential education. So this is at a place called Kamastashtan in the interior of the Labrador Quebec Peninsula about in 2009. And, you know, whoops, do I go back? You know, sorry. So, you know, this is an example of the transmission of knowledge. This woman here called Shanat, and Sage is the girl who's now much older. There's a porcupine there. They've built a camp. In fact, they built a few cabins on one side of Kamastastan Lake. But the preparation of the porcupine, it's a real science. To be able to know exactly how to hunt, track, kill, and prepare the porcupine is very technical. And it's also a very nutritious food to eat in the subarctic because it has a lot of fat, it has a layer of fat, and most of the animals there have very little fat, like the caribou. So, you know, this is an important piece of education. And then the hunting of, they're called wapineo in ptarmigan. And then, you know, skills like this, which are incredible skills. So during the winter, you may have 10 feet of ice, but the Innu and other northern peoples have developed techniques to put fishing nets under the ice, 10 feet under the ice. And so, and men and women equally participate in all of these kinds of skills. So that's, you know, just another example of why it's important to kind of maintain this knowledge and the language within which this knowledge is transmitted. You should always put yourself in the picture. This is me with, on the left, Mani Anasha and Sam Pyogi, who are a family that I stay with in one of the Innu villages called Natwashish. And that's a spring encampment. So from there, people would be fishing, they would be hunting, they would be going out, but all the kids would be learning. In fact, everybody would be learning. It's a sort of total immersive learning experience. And then, as part of of my work with the Innu, I teamed up with this filmmaker. You can see at the bottom the woman. Sarah Sandring, and she made 2 films, which I'll show in a second. And basically, those films were supported by the Innu Nation, and they wanted films to document some of their history, but also to document education. So the one on the right, Nuchumit, or on the land, Nuchumit just means the country for the Innu, and that film was about the transmission of knowledge between grandparents and grandchildren, sorry, mostly grandmothers, because grandmothers were some of the most important purveyors of Innu knowledge. And we also, when we made those 2 films, I was more or less the scriptwriter, but Sarah did the films, was an amazing filmmaker in minus 40-degree temperatures. When we were doing that, we made filmmaking part of the educational experience. So there were Innu youth that were trained to use the film equipment. They did quite a lot of the interviews as well. And this is just to sort of end this section. So I know myself that when I went there, I realized how out of my depth I was, how inept I was in this particular environment. And a lot of the truths that I had known just fell away. And I saw that, you know, the famous novelist Barbara Kingsolver, who was a student at the University of Arizona when I was, and one of my friends was her boyfriend, but she dumped him. But this new book that she's done was one that actually she wrote just after she graduated from the U of A. And, you know, she says there that when her parents, I think, were missionaries, and they were in the Congo, and that when she went there, a lot of the knowledge that she previously had didn't really apply in that context. So this is all a sort of a plea to say that knowledge is plural, and it's very important to know about the different kinds of knowledge in the world. Okay. Now on to the second part. Yeah, we'll come back to that. So the reverse can also occur. You can have destructive inclusion, you can have destructive exclusion. We know that or at least I know that in the two countries that I'm most intimately knowledgeable about, the US and Britain, access to education has been and is unequal, and it varies according to class, race, ability, and a number of other familial circumstances, including what the sociologist Bourdieu called cultural capital. Among working class people in Britain, there's an ambivalence about formal education, especially university education, but I think education as a whole. And studies done by sociologists of education have pointed out a number of things about British schooling. One is the language of the classroom is the language of the English middle classes. It is not the language of the working classes. So there was I'm not going to go into this, but there was a sociolinguist called Basil Bernstein. And Basil Bernstein said that, working class people and middle class people have very different codes. One is elaborated and one is restricted. And he actually thought the working class form of speaking was actually richer, and it was less tied to specific meanings than middle class. But because of their accent and because of their way of speaking, for a long time, British working class children were inferiorized by the teachers. Their accent was seen in need of correction, and the expectations of them was chronically low. In 1944, there was an Education Act which mandated that at age 11, there was an 11+ exam, and those who passed it would go on to grammar school and on to university. Those who failed it would go to what's called a secondary modern school and into a vocation. So one's fate was decided at 11. I came to the United States at 12. When I was 11, I failed the 11+. Had I not came to the United States at 12, I wouldn't be here now. I would have been on another track, and I'll come back to that again. And also this 11+ was kind of motivated by genetic theories of intelligence, that working class people were genetically less intelligent, and that test scores reflected these biological differences. It also had a gender dimension. The same pattern of discouraging working class girls also applied. Many sociological studies of girls, up until the 90s, I would say, or the 80s anyway, from relatively poor communities in England, have shown that until fairly recently, the schools reinforced the long-standing cultural belief that education was less important for girls. And even there's evidence that 11+ examination results were doctored when some of the main framers of the 11+ exam found that girls were passing at a rate that they didn't like, and so some of the results were actually doctored. This state of affairs, continued till quite recently. And some of you might know who Fiona Hill is. She was an advisor, I believe, in the first Trump administration, and she was from County Durham in the north of England. So she had a very pronounced northern accent, and she says in her memoir there that when she went to Oxford, she was clever enough to get an interview to be admitted at Oxford. There was the person interviewing her at Oxford insisted that there was another student from a place also in Northumberland come and act as a translator for her. which was very insulting. And so she says, you know, she was just discouraged from continuing with higher education. She eventually went to Harvard. She became a great scholar. She's a Russian analyst. She speaks Russian and Ukrainian and several languages. And anyway, this is kind of her memoir of how things played out for her, and you can imagine that if she had stayed in Britain, that wouldn't have been the case. There's also a racial dimension. So in Britain, migrants, particularly from the Caribbean in the 1960s, their children entered English schools in the cities, and those children also were inferiorized. Their accents were inferiorized. The teachers had little interest in the cultures, the incredibly rich, amazing cultures that they are from. And this report came out, and it's kind of been rediscovered now, and people are talking about it, by Bernard Cohen, who is from Grenada. And he says, he documents how Afro-Caribbean children were being depicted as of low intelligence and sent to schools for the subnormal and trained basically for a life of manual labor. And in the US, in the US, the same thing obtained as well. This is, I think, a fantastic study by Kenneth Clark. You might know, Kenneth Clark was one of the main figures behind the 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. But he came from Harlem, and in the 60s, he wrote a book, a kind of a ethnographic study of the place where he comes from. And he spent some time in the schools and notes that the same kind of thing that was going on in Britain, that the teachers had very low expectations of the kids. And as he said, these children do not learn because they are not being taught effective. And they are not being taught because those who are charged with teaching them do not believe they can learn, do not expect they can learn, and do not act towards them in ways that help them to learn. So you have a racial dimension to it here. So where does this lead us? If we turn to university education, the same pattern applies. And I'll just, whoops. Oh, here we go, sorry. This was a very important book in the 1980s by a sociologist called Paul Willis, Learning to Labor, How Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs. And what he was doing there was he was studying a school in the Midlands, and he finds this same pattern, that teachers had very low expectations of working class kids, that the kids themselves developed an oppositional culture. So they started actually saying, you know, starting rebelling against the teacher, rebelling against the school, preying on students that were good at school, etc. And you know, this was a seminal book which kind of showed like why the British class system seems to be so rigid and why it seems to stay in the way it is, and why education plays such a dominant role in it. And it should, I think it does account in part for why working class people are skeptical about education and universities. Now, since this time, access has widened. We know that. But in both countries, when access has widened, what else has happened? Tuition fees have been increased. So as soon as you widen access and allow more people who've traditionally been excluded, you introduce tuition fees. In Britain, the outstanding student loan debt is about $260 billion. In this country, is way, way high. It's in the trillions. I think it's $1.7 trillion. So there are opportunities, but they come at a price. So I'll just end with the third part then. So where does this lead us? So it's led me up to this point to say that education, I believe, should be more pluralistic and it should be more inclusive, and that colleges and universities play a really important role in this, just even as physical spaces, as spaces where young people can engage in what was called the higher learning. They can be exposed to knowledge that has been developed within their societies and other societies. They can associate with other students in a kind of a vibrant culture of engagement with the world of ideas, debates, and friendship. You know, I'm still friends with people that I met in my undergraduate studies. So when higher education is discussed, there's usually two main narratives of its purpose. One is it's for success. Policymakers and institutions generally mean that colleges and universities should be to prepare a person for the world of work through mastering bodies of knowledge relevant to different kinds of work. A second narrative is it's to cultivate the imagination, critical thought, self-reliance, independence of mind, and self-reflection. And these are perhaps what are needed in a democracy, in a democratic society. And that there can be huge benefits that come from immersing oneself in the kind of diverse environment that colleges and universities create. And the person that I'm going to lean on, maybe if it works, is Martha Nussbaum. And I think this is a very important, it's been a very important book for me, called Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. And basically, she says that these two narratives are not mutually exclusive. So that education can be for jobs, but it also can be to cultivate all these other qualities. But the problem is, and she says boldly at the beginning of the book, that there's a silent crisis in education, and that democratic countries like Britain and the US and their publics have started to undervalue the educational basis of democracy and promote rote learning, test-based information, uncritical approaches to knowledge. And this form of education is more suited, she says, to subjects that do not require extended reflection, but are fact-based. So this is enhanced, I must say, by the fragmentation of knowledge in colleges and universities. So at my university, you have these departments, which I think you probably have here, and there are high walls between them. And that really channels students towards seeing the world through kind of a very limited prism. She thinks that education should be as broad as possible, and she draws on older ideas. Up, I don't know if I did two then or one. She draws on older ideas such as those from John Dewey and Rabindranath Tagore and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I'm going to mention a bit more in a bit. And she says that their ideas can be used to help produce well-adjusted, creative, and dynamic citizens of our societies. And so Dewey, who's an American philosopher, has an extended reflection on education. If any of you are considering reading this, he's quite a dull writer. But some of the things that he says, I think, are very important. And he says, if you have social class in a society, education or intellectual opportunities must be available to all on equitable terms. And if they're not, then the whole hierarchical structure of the society is exposed. she believes in, please go. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Could you do well, oh, yeah. She also believes in the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote this incredible book called Emile, which is basically a primer for the education of a person. And he says boldly at the beginning that, you know, in our society, meaning European society, the raising of children is a calamitous mixture of mollycoddling and neglect. And that children and adolescents need to be able to explore the world while also being taken care of. And this is what education should be. So education should be a framework of sorts, but it also should allow people to explore. So it shouldn't just be rote learning. And in a strange symmetry, I found that his ideas were not so far off those of a very famous writer that you find, whose books you find in the bookstores of Arizona and the West, is Louis L'Amour, who's a Western writer. He's probably second only to Zane Grey. And he wrote an incredible memoir called Education of a Wandering Man. And he says in that education itself a breadth of view, ease of understanding, tolerance for others, and a background from which the mind can explore in any direction. So it's a framework, it's a jumping off, it's a platform to continue from. So taking some cues from Rousseau, and I take some cues from Louis L'Amour, Nussbaum argues that education should be not only as broad as possible, but in making it broad, it cultivates a sensitivity to others. It cultivates the ability to make decisions for yourself and not burden other people. And it assists people in imaginatively interacting with their total environment. So as we grow older, we need less rote learning. And we need more taking charge of our own education. But teachers have to be able to cultivate that in their students. So as teachers, we should be helping to give students the ability to think, analyze, and interpret the world for themselves. She believes that one condition for this is that the knowledge that's transmitted in colleges and universities should be as independent as possible. That is, you know, research should be for its own sake. It shouldn't be for individual gain. It shouldn't be for a business interest. It shouldn't be for a political interest. Hence, the title of her book, Not for Profit. Why, you know, democracy needs this kind of education. She believes that teachers, that the knowledge imparted should emerge through dialogue, what she calls a Socratic dialogue, and not through a monologue, which kind of I'm giving now, but it should be through a dialogue. And that helps the student follow an argument. It helps students use evidence and logic as a basis for forming their own judgments. And as she says, someone trained, can you move that? Someone trained to follow an argument rather than just numbers or formulas is the sort of person to have in a democracy, the kind of person that would stand against pressure to say something false or hasty. And this should include being able to accept and consider multiple points of view. And I don't have really time to talk about this, but this is prize-winning author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who's from Nigeria but lives in the United States. She won a big prize for Half of the Yellow Sun. But she's written many other novels. But there's a beautiful little TED talk which you can look at if you want, in which she warns against the danger of the singular story, and making she said power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story, to say a particular group of people are X or a particular group of people are Y. They make one story become the only story. But she gives a nice illustration in there of how multiple stories are very important. And just actually going back to my Innu research, in that film that I showed you about called called Nutak, the other one, a man at the end of the film is telling a story about the relocation of the Innu, a man called Jacques Nui, and he says, at the end of the interview, he says, "This is my story. Other people will tell different stories. This is how stories should be told." In other words, there's no one single vantage point, which is a trump card over everyone, every other story. The problem, she thinks, with this education for jobs only is it's an impoverished notion of education. It tends to be instrumentalist, concerned with rote learning, test preparation, single answers, no ambiguity, complex issues are boiled down to single answers. And this is not, in her view, this is Nussbaum's view, what a university should be about. And she says that people behave badly when no one raises a critical voice, and that instrumentalist education produces a culture of yes people, the kind of people that will sometimes fall for demagogues, people that will fall for others who seek influence and power through mere assertion without evidence, through tweets or through, you know, a lot of single stories are now told by tweets, are told by single sentences. And I think George Orwell, warned us of this kind of possibility in 1984. And in the unsupported assertion, the tweet, the meme, or whatever, is a form of reduction of knowledge. And this was the whole objective of Newspeak. It was to eliminate words, eliminate historical events, delete a whole range of thoughts. And the shorter the less your vocabulary, the less ways in which you can think about the world. So Nussbaum is saying we should go for the opposite of that, unless you want authoritarian rule. And just a few illustrations. One illustration of this is I know it's very controversial, but the affirmative action debate in the US. And in this decision, which was in 2003, which basically, Grutter versus Bollinger, it stated that, affirmative action could continue, but under very limited circumstances. One of the protagonists in it was the president of the University of Michigan. And here's what he says. He's that diversity is not merely, a desirable addition to a well-run education. It's as essential as all these other forms of study. And there was, for a time being, right, maybe there still is in the US, this diversity mandate. So many, universities believe that it's very important to have students from different backgrounds. They interact with each other, they learn from each other, etc. Next one. And one of the supporters of this was the Arizona Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who in that decision said a diverse student body enhances education. It doesn't, by including more minorities, it doesn't prevent non-minority students also from being part of the university community. And universities occupy a special niche in our constitutional tradition. Finally, maybe, almost finally, W.E.B. Du Bois, at the end, he was the first African-American sociologist trained at Harvard. And The Souls of Black Folk, if you haven't read it, is a brilliant book. It's a beautiful piece of writing. And he believed, again, it was education and universities that would help confront the entrenched problems that followed from enslavement in the US. And he said, only by a union of intelligence and sympathy across the color line shall justice and right triumph. And he thought that educational institutions had an important role in that. Also, just almost finished, another important thing about the kind of education that Nussbaum is promoting is the study of languages. And it's quite alarming that even at elite universities such as UC Berkeley, where I was actually last week, they're cutting down the offering of languages. But to be able to speak another language is the ability to understand a different worldview. And so it's very different. It's very important to be able to I'm sure there are people here that speak other languages. And if you speak another language, you're thinking in a slightly different way as well. And that's very important to the whole panoply of human knowledge. So what about jobs? Factual knowledge alone is not enough. We need what Ginny was saying earlier to me privately is soft skills. We need the kind of skills that a well-rounded education will provide people. And even if you think about business and business innovation, it requires flexibility of mind. It requires creativity and openness, and it really requires critical thought and evidence as well. Otherwise, the business will fail. And one thing that I do back home in England is every weekend I read the Financial Times, because the Financial Times puts the main stories of the world in political and economic perspective. And one of the columnists there, I think lives in the US, is Gillian Tett, and she said in a recent issue, when these soft skills are lacking, business culture quickly loses steam. So you need both. And I think I've said enough, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions? Don't be scared. No? That's
anything you really wanted to know but you were afraid to ask?
Here, let me bring you the microphone. That way the people, we can pick it up on the tape. Here you are.
So you mentioned inclusion in the campus by race, but if there's no, or not inclusion, but diversity, but if there's no diversity in thought, and everyone truly thinks the same thing, could you really call it diversity?
Very good question. Well, hopefully, if one is exposed to the kind of education that I'm advocating and that people like Martha Nussbaum is advocating, there will be diversity of thought. If you learn about different cultures, if you learn different subjects, if you learn science as well as humanities and arts, there will not be tunnel vision. I feel I've had a very good education, and it began at the university. Well, it began when I was a child, but in this country, at the University of Arizona, I think it's still the case now. You have to take a wide variety of courses, right, in your first year. So I had to take, science. I had to take literature. I can remember reading Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, and they really opened my mind. So I would say that you will have diversity if you have a broader education. If you have a narrow education, you won't.
Anyone else? All
right. Thank you very much, first of all, for the talk. So I'm an associate dean here in humanities, and when you were speaking, I couldn't help but think about Arizona State's, or the state of Arizona's revision to the general education programming that every college student who wants to matriculate has to complete. And that's a revision that's going on past couple years and is going to be, I think, formalized by maybe this fall. Does anybody know? Something like that. Anyhow, it's a big deal. And I as I was listening to you, I was thinking about the phrase general education, kind of in between the lines of what you were saying. Could you talk just for a couple minutes about, your thinking of general education as an American phenomenon, and if it's still something that we should aspire by requiring, for example, every college student to take like 36 credit hours of diverse subjects?
Well, I'm a bit rusty because I haven't taught here or studied in taught in a US university for a long time. But as far as I'm aware, that general education is still in place, right? And to be honest, I think that's something that I've benefited from immensely. If I would have done my first degree in England, and I'm a sociologist, I would only take sociology courses, unless I made a special plea for a special syllabus to do something else. So I'm glad I took literature and political science and philosophy and anthropology and film, these things. So I think, let me just say, okay, I'll give you a quick anecdote. So back home at the University of Essex, I was once director of an interdisciplinary program, or a couple of them, one in American studies. And so I had to come to, because of my knowledge of US universities, I was asked to be director of that. And the students would take American history, American literature, American politics, American culture, and I can't remember. And I think they could take languages. The Spanish language it's a very important language in the US, and American history. Anyway. And then I also teach sociology students. And there's obviously very good sociology students. But the American studies students, in my view, were far better. And partly because they also had to do a study abroad. They had to come to the US. And so they left as kind of stiff Brits. And they came back with baseball caps on backwards and, all kinds of college paraphernalia, go Gophers or whatever, and I just thought they were more optimistic. They had a more well-rounded view they were more confident. So I support that, and I hope the US does not abandon that, because I think it's one of your best assets, really.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please help me in thanking Dr. Samson for coming to see us today.